Very much. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody. Let me get going. Sit down. Thank you very much. Thank you very much indeed. On the morning after I resigned as leader of our wonderful party, and after that devastating election result, I decided to go out and buy myself a phone. It's not that funny. You have to buy a phone. Rather than moping at home, I thought I'd go out and cheer myself up and spend some money on some new gadgets. After all, I was expecting at any minute a sort of grim-faced Home Office official was going to turn up and demand back instantly my security-vetted government BlackBerry. So I figured what better way to prepare for life out of government than getting my own phone. And off I went with my oldest boy, Antonio, to the nearest high street. Now, I was braced, as I hope you can imagine, for lots of awkward, sideways glances from the fellow shoppers that morning. After all, we had just been subject to a very public drubbing at the hands of voters across the whole of the country. But instead, something quite unexpected happened. Person after person came up to me and they said how sorry they were, how undeserved they felt the result was, how unfairly they thought we'd been treated. And I remember one lady in particular who, she had tears in her eyes and she came up and she embraced me. She said, "Oh, it's so awful." I said, "I know, it's a crying shame." And I said to her, logically enough, I said, "Well, thank you for supporting the Liberal Democrats." And she said, "No, I didn't, I voted Green." And I've thought about that reaction. I've thought about that reaction a lot since then. And I'm sure you may have seen something similar yourself. It's as if lots of voters have experienced some kind of buyer's remorse in the wake of such an unanticipated result. Of course, one sympathetic reaction doesn't tell the whole complex story, and I certainly don't tell it to absolve myself of my own mistakes and miscalculations. But I think it does show that there is still a tremendous amount of goodwill out there towards us. In some strange way, people seem to understand what we stood for and stand for, and what they have now lost, more through the defeat that we suffered at the polls than through our victories in government. And those achievements in government, in turn, wouldn't have happened without you. So, thank you. Thank you to each and every single one of you. Whether you liked or loathed the coalition, whether you were exhilarated or exasperated by my leadership, thank you. Your resilience, your good humor, your decency, your unity throughout everything we've gone through over the last several years has been truly humbling. We stuck together in the face of pressures which would have broken other parties apart, and we came together when other parties would have fallen apart. Just look at the leadership contest in the Labour Party compared to our leadership contest. Labour's contest was shrill, angry, and divisive, a sort of exercise in collective self-denial as Labour members rushed to bury their past, embarrassed by their own record. By contrast, the contest between Tim and Norman was thoughtful, respectful, well, most of the time at least, asking the right questions about our future, but proud and unembarrassed by our past. Labour battered at the ballot box, now battering each other and only speaking to itself. The Liberal Democrats, battered too at the ballot box, but now coming together to give the country the decent, liberal centre-ground alternative it so desperately needs. And haven't we just got the best possible man to lead that charge than our new leader, Tim Farron. I've known Tim as a colleague and a friend for many, many years. Well, I discovered more about his tastes in 1980s music this morning, but apart from that, what I've always known about him, and we all know, he is by far the best political campaigner I've ever come across anywhere in politics. He is generous to a fault, he is a liberal to his fingertips, and he's brave. Were you as proud as I was to be a Liberal Democrat this summer, when Conservative ministers were reclining on sun loungers across Europe, or scaremongering about swarms of migrants here at home, and there was at least one politician prepared to actually go to Calais and put a human face on the statistics, to show compassion, not derision, in the face of that unfolding humanitarian crisis? That was our Tim Farron. Leadership isn't always easy. Politics is a noisy, brutal business. Leaders are told to do that, not do that, go this way, not go that way. But leaders should also be allowed to lead. And that is why Tim deserves and will get our undivided support and loyalty as he leads our fight back across the length and breadth of our country. And now, my friends, we face a new reality. It might not feel fair. We got 1 million more votes than the SNP, yet we've only got a seventh of the seats that they've got in Parliament. The Tories only got 24% of the eligible vote, and yet they have a majority in the Commons. Yet, it is the reality that we need to deal with. Now, I got to know David Cameron and George Osborne pretty well over the 5 years that we shared power. And they have many qualities, some good, a fair number pretty bad. But one in particular really helped them out in this election. They are lucky generals. They took over the Conservative Party 10 years ago when the Labour Party was starting to sink into those Blair-Brown wars. They then fought an election campaign in 2010 against the Labour Party just after Gordon Brown had crashed the British economy. Then they were in government, which had to make big, difficult cuts in public spending, and yet it was their coalition partners, us, who copped all the political blame. And now they face a divided and directionless Labour Party, cut off at the knees by the SNP surge in Scotland and a much reduced Liberal Democrat presence in Parliament. George Osborne and David Cameron cannot believe their luck. They're back in government on their own for the first time in almost 20 years with no effective opposition and no coalition partner to keep them honest. So what is it that they do now that they can finally do what they want? What is it they actually do? Bully the BBC, denigrate refugees, repeal human rights laws, attack the unions, remove help for the working poor, revive the Snoopers Charter, undermine our place in Europe, threaten to scrap free school meals, and reverse pretty well every green measure introduced in recent years. You simply couldn't make it up. We've got UKIP wanting to turn the clock back to the 1950s. Jeremy Corbyn wanted to turn the clock back to the 1970s. David Cameron and George Osborne turning the clock back to the 1980s. The SNP want to bring us back to, what, the 1600s? What is their problem with the 21st century? And no wonder more people now say they appreciate what we did in government. They can see what happens the moment we leave the room. Now, lots of our critics used to say, didn't they, endlessly, oh, the Liberal Democrats, they're making no difference in government. Say that to the single mother working flat out as a nurse, who's now going to lose £2,000, a staggering £2,000, because of George Osborne's budget. Some working person's budget that was. Say that. Say that. Say that to the head of the further education college, desperately trying to give young people a chance to get ahead in life, who's going to find their budget cut to the bone because the Conservatives simply don't understand the virtue and the importance of vocational education. Say that to the thousands of people working in our once burgeoning green industry whose jobs are now at risk because the Conservatives don't have any time for all that green crap. And in a twist which would be laughable if it was not so absurd, George Osborne and David Cameron seek to claim that their government is governing from the centre ground. Now, look, I need to get something off my chest about this whole centre ground thing. I realise that there are some who felt and feel that by pinning our colours to the centre ground, that we risk sounding a little insipid, a sort of not on the one hand nor on the other kind of party. And, as it happens, I accept the observation that has been made that by choosing to talk about the centre ground in relation to the other parties in the run-up to the last election, you remember all that head and heart stuff, that we risked making the centre ground sound like a sort of tactical choice, rather than a place full of conviction and values. I'm not sure, to be honest, that we had much of a strategic alternative, but I accept the criticism and I take full responsibility for it. But what I do not accept for 1 second is that the liberal, progressive, modern centre ground of British politics is an insipid place to be. There's nothing insipid in showing compassion rather than intolerance, or reason rather than prejudice, in believing that the freedom and privacy of individuals should be cherished, not frittered away. There's nothing insipid in believing that social mobility, real opportunity, can't be provided to millions of our fellow citizens unless we first do the hard graft of creating a stable, strong and prosperous British economy, or believing that our clapped-out political institutions are in desperate need of a complete overhaul. And there's nothing insipid in believing that we should stand tall in the world, not retreat to the false appeal of nationalism and chauvinism. So tolerant, compassionate, rational, progressive, and open, not closed to the world. That is the centre ground I believe in and always have. And the great irony of all of this, as Tim has quite rightly pointed out, is that just at the moment when we've been knocked to the floor, a great big liberal-sized hole has opened up in the middle of British politics. And in that huge chasm between a self-serving Tory government and a far-left opposition lies our great opportunity. Because right now, they're not speaking for mainstream Britain. They're not arguing for liberal values. They're not standing up for a Britain that is open, generous, and outward-looking. The centre ground of British politics is standing empty. That is our opportunity. That is where we belong. And that is where, under Tim's leadership, the fight back begins. And as we seek to fill that gap, of course we should reach out to moderates in other parties, especially the Labour Party, but the Conservative Party too, who also believe that progress is only really possible from the progressive centre of politics. All my political life, I have tried to demonstrate that working with other parties is not a sin, it can be a virtue. Time and time again, I have seen the opportunity for real progress thwarted by the dead hand of Westminster tribalism. And now, as politics enters an unprecedentedly fluid time, I hope those in other parties who embrace the kind of liberalism we believe in will be willing to work with us across party lines in Parliament and outside Parliament to assemble a progressive, modern challenge to the unimaginative conservatism of this government. In any event, we will be sharing platforms with other parties very soon in what is the most momentous decision, in my view, that this country faces in a generation. Do we remain in or do we leave the European Union? The stakes could not be higher. Not just one, but now two unions hang in the balance. If we vote to leave the European Union, I have no doubt that the SNP will gleefully take the opportunity to persuade or seek to persuade the people of Scotland to leave what remains of the United Kingdom. And then what? Then what? Do we want our children, our grandchildren, to live in a once great country now torn apart? A Great Britain turned into a little England, drifting friendlessly somewhere in the mid-Atlantic? I've no doubt that David Cameron's referendum will be contested on the issue of jobs, economic security, the terms of any renegotiation, and so on. But there's a big, enduring question which hangs over all of this. What kind of country do we want to be? What role do we want to play in this globalized world of ours? Open or closed? Leading in our own European backyard or isolated from our nearest neighbours? Because let's be clear, for all the huffing and puffing we're going to hear from those who want us to leave the European Union, they have no answer to that fundamental strategic question. Is America, Uncle Sam, going to help us out if we cut ourselves off from our European backyard? Of course not. We may share bonds of language and history, but the Americans have been unsentimentally clear in pointing out that our relevance to them will be much diminished if our importance in Berlin and Paris and Brussels is diminished too. The Chinese, the Indians, they simply can't understand why we're even contemplating relinquishing our leadership role in our own European hemisphere. And that is why the ambivalence of the new Labour Party leadership is so utterly perplexing. Over many years, we've all got used to the outright isolationism of the Conservative Party. But Labour? On a number of occasions in recent years, I've seen the Labour Party abandon its progressive principles to score short-term political points. Failing to support House of Lords reform, barely lifting a finger to help in the AV referendum, blocking party funding reform. But I say to Jeremy Corbyn, this EU referendum is simply too important for ambivalence. Whether we remain in or out of Europe is an existential question for Britain. If we leave, we face an uncertain and isolated future. If we stay in, we can lead as a strong European power. And that is why, my friends, we must strain every sinew to fight this referendum and to win. These are not easy times for Liberals. Across Europe, Liberals are on the back foot as the politics of fear, of populism, of us versus them is on the rise. But however much the result of the election hurts, and it does, I will never waver in my pride in what we achieved in coalition. We achieved remarkable things in remarkably difficult circumstances. Whether it's a young girl with mental health problems who now gets treated rather than ignored, or a boy from a poor family who finally gets the attention he deserves at school, the millions of families who get to keep a little bit more of the money they earn, whether it's the pensioner who now has greater security in old age, the child who starts out at school with a healthy, free lunch every day, or the gay couple who finally get to celebrate their love through marriage. We may never know. We may never know. We may never know how many millions of people we helped across the country. But these are real achievements for real people in the real world, and we must never, ever allow our opponents to take that away from us. So thank you. So thank you for making all that possible. As searing as it was to be beaten as badly as we were, as difficult as it is to make our voice heard when we've been reduced in size, I believe firmly that under Tim's outstanding leadership, we can be the comeback kids of British politics, starting at next May's elections. It won't be easy. It won't be instant. And there will be setbacks along the way. But we will bounce back, because there is a place in British politics for tolerance, reason, and compassion. There is a place in British politics for an open-minded, outward-looking, optimistic party, because as dawn follows the darkest hour, there is now space in British politics for a great fight back by the most resilient political party in Britain, the Liberal Democrats. Thank you very much.